everyone. Today I'm going to be recording a reading of the first chapter of the Dominion Genesis, which is the first in an 8-book series I'm currently working on. I just thought it would be fun to give y'all an idea of what it's like so far. I was originally just going to do this for my family and friends, but I kept having technical difficulties with my phone, and Facebook and Instagram have limits on the set file sizes you can post, so I'm just doing it this way instead. I hope you guys enjoy it. Keep in mind the story is still very work in progress at this point, so it might be changed later. Okay. Chapter 1, Wish for Something New. Caden scanned the living room, making sure his parents and sisters were still asleep. He didn't want to get in trouble. He knew his birthday was almost over, but getting trouble on your birthday still sucked. He quietly took the thing his mother had called Discman off the vid screen stand, as well as the thingy she'd given him for his birthday. It was a round black disc kept in a plastic case lined with a dark purple booklet with pictures of stars and the earth in a cube thing. She'd said it was called a CD, short for compact disc. Apparently, it was one of the ways people had listened to music on Earth before everything went digital. Remembering his mother's instructions, he popped open the Discman and removed the CD from its case, being careful not to touch the shiny silver side. Once it was safely nestled inside the Discman, he closed the lid and plugged in the headphones. It was a bit tricky since he wasn't used to handling headphones with cords. He wondered how anyone had ever known how to use these things. He then slipped the headphones over his ears and carried the Discman to the living room viewport. As he settled into the glass bubble, he pushed the button on the Discman that meant play. Thankfully, that part wasn't as hard because the symbols looked just like the digital buttons on his father's tablet screen. The music was wonderful. It reminded Caden of some of his favorite space movies and made him feel as though he were floating through space. He could almost pretend the viewport wasn't there, no glass to separate him from the shining stars above and the beautiful blue and green earth below. Most kids would probably be scared by this thought, but Caden wasn't. After all, he was 4 now, and 4-year-olds weren't scared of anything. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the chimes in the song were the twinkles of the stars around him. As the song transitioned into a steady guitar riff and what sounded like calm chatter, he pictured himself as a bird slowly spreading his wings. Down the last line of the calm chatter, "I'm coming home," he was ready to soar. Britain Starliner, 3000 AD. Caden Maverick awoke to the sensation of his crisp white pillowcase touching his cheek, the last traces of his childhood memory fading from his vision. The circadian lights in the small cabin he shared with his sister, his best friend, and his best friend's brother were still the deep purple shade indicating lights out. He sighed, not feeling the least bit surprised. He always had a habit of waking up before everyone else. For most people, this wouldn't be such a big deal, but Caden wasn't most people. He didn't bother doing it right then and there, but he knew that if he lifted the pale bedspread covering him and looked down at his body, he'd see the white Star Wars t-shirt and matching shorts he'd worn to bed, and absolutely nothing beneath that. To put it simply, he had no legs beneath the knee, due to an unfortunate accident when he was 8 years old. He normally wore a pair of prosthetics to move around, but he was supposed to get fitted for new prosthetics today and needed his friend Asher to help him into a wheelchair. And that wasn't possible right now with Asher snoring loudly in the bunk above him. Sighing, he instead reached behind his pillow and grabbed his beat-up paperback copy of Fahrenheit 451. It was all wrinkled, torn, and discolored, like a pile of soiled bed sheets in a trash heap. Caden might have been tempted to throw it away a long time ago had it not been gifted to him by his father when he turned 11. He leafed through the yellowing, dog-eared pages and stopped on the latest sheet that had yet to be marked by his drawing pencils. then opened a small plastic case that was wedged into his wall cubby and produced a small charcoal pencil. There was no need to worry about straining his eyes too much to see, since the night lights were black lights and therefore illuminated the book's pages just fine. Making sure not to press the pencil too hard to the paper so the text could still show through the lines, he carefully drew several swooping lines with some light shading here and there. Markings eventually took the shape of a California condor, spreading its large majestic wings from one end of the paper to the other. As Caden stared at the drawing, he wondered what it would be like to be a condor, to not even need your legs half the time, to soar as high as you wanted, without limits. Sure, he could somewhat replicate that feeling when he was in a cockpit, but it wasn't quite the same thing as what a bird experienced. Just then, the circadian lights switched from night purple to blinding morning white. As Caden squinted through the sudden shift in brightness, Asher, dressed in a navy blue nightshirt and black shorts, slid down from the upper bunk, grinning from ear to ear. "Rise and shine, loser!" he shouted, slapping Caden's thigh. Caden groaned and pulled his pillow over his face. "I've been up, but thanks anyway, Ash." Asher's smile fell at hearing that. Oh man. He raked a hand with black painted fingernails through his unkempt mop of reddish brown hair that always looked in need of a cut. "I'm really sorry about that. Are you okay?" "Yeah," Caden said, trying to moderate the irritation in his voice. He shoved his book and pencil back into the cubby. "Can you please just help me get me out of bed?" Asher nodded and reached for Caden's wheelchair, which was presently collapsed against the wall. As he pushed the button that would firm it, Caden pulled off his blanket and welcomed the chill on his bare arms. Asher then signaled over to his younger brother Finn, who slept on the bunk across from Caden's. Finn's curly blonde hair was mashed on one side from sleeping, and his blue eyes were bloodshot. "Finn, you mind helping me out here?" Finn curtly nodded and dragged himself out of bed. He wore a baggy NASA t-shirt over a pair of black sweatpants. He handled Caden's upper legs while Asher handled his arms. Together they lifted Caden out of bed and hoisted him into his wheelchair. First thing Caden saw once his butt hit the black leather seat was his younger sister Serenity. She watched them from the bunk above Finn's, like a bird perched in a tree. Her long, dirty blonde hair framed her heart-shaped face in sheets around her shoulders. She was clothed in a cream nightshirt decorated with sunflowers. Her tired pea-green eyes trailed them like a hawk. "Morning, Seren," Caden said with a half-smile. "Did you sleep okay?" She shrugged. "Yeah, I guess." His heart sank upon hearing that. He could tell by her tone that she hadn't actually slept okay, but he knew it was best not to press her with other people around. Asher and Finn quickly got dressed into their black and blue Olympus Federation flight suits before brushing their teeth and combing their hair in the small closet-sized bathroom all four of them shared. They also made sure to pass Caden a teal sweatshirt and a paste-covered toothbrush. The whole time, Serenity kept her blankets pulled over her head so she couldn't see them. She'd get dressed once they were out of the room. Caden kept his eyes glued to her bunk for a while. Unlike the industrial white covers of most of the bunks on the ship, hers was a soft pink. The alcove next to her also had a painting of a meadow of pink freesia flowers. All in all, lots of pink. It was meant to help her feel calmer, but she'd always expressed that it felt cloying, almost like eating marshmallows covered in sugar. Caden couldn't help feeling bad for her whenever he saw all the pink, but Serenity never complained about it too much. According to her, it wasn't the worst thing she had to see all day. He looked back to his bunk, which Asher was currently straightening up, specifically on the book that sat in the cubby. "Hey Asher, could you give Serenity my book?" Asher briefly shot him a look, but nonetheless grabbed Fahrenheit 451 and passed it to Serenity. She faced Caden and smiled gratefully. "Thanks, Caden." "No problem, Seren," Caden replied. Serenity always liked looking at his sketches, so he felt it might keep her occupied for a while. Asher lifted Caden's bunk and pulled out a standard sketchbook, a case of charcoal pencils, and a bottle of varnish from the personal effects Caden kept in the compartment before plopping the materials into Caden's lap. Caden smiled appreciatively at his friend. At After nearly a decade of friendship, Asher was now well acquainted with Caden's preference for having his drawing things handy whenever possible. For a moment, Caden caught a faint reflection of himself in the book's shiny black cover. Fair-skinned face, hazel eyes, short dark brown hair that was slightly mussed from sleeping, all features that made him a near spitting image of his father Wyatt. He was just beginning to neaten up his hair when his attention was suddenly caught by the sound of paper rustling. Asher was grabbing the heap of magazines his bed was usually covered with and shoving them haphazardly into his own bunk compartment. Caden sighed. Asher loved collecting old magazines of long-dead celebrities, both men and women, whom he found incredibly hot. It was a relatively harmless hobby for the most part, but it often meant his bunk was messier than regulation allowed. Even still, though, Caden couldn't help feeling a little sad as he watched the cleanup, since the magazines were often the only splash of color and life in the otherwise sterile cabin, aside from Serenity's bed. After tucking a few magazines under his arm and hanging the silver locket he always wore around his neck, Asher lowered his bunk back into place and slid down to the floor. He was greeted by Finn, who held his, Asher, and Caden's dog tags in hand. Finn then passed each set of dog tags to its proper owner. Caden paused to look at his before slipping them on. The silver tags had the same basic identification information as anyone else in the Olympus Federation. The one thing that set his apart was that they shared a chain with a small other charm that an image of the star Castor had been artistically burnt into. Finn was about to open the door when Asher suddenly called, "Hang on, I need one more thing." He grabbed something from his bedpost and put it into each of his ears, his favorite pair of earrings. Cain smirked. He had little doubt Jean, Asher and Finn's older sister, would give Asher a hard time once she saw those. As they were about to leave, Finn took one last look at Serenity, who'd emerged from her pink blanket cocoon. "Hey, Seren, I'll make sure to save you some pancakes in the mess hall." He gave her a small half-smile. She blushed until she was about the same shade of pink as the freesia flowers painted behind her, but still smiled. "Okay," she said, partially hiding her face behind Caden's book. Caden quietly chuckled to himself, but Asher just rolled his eyes. "Come on, Finn," he said, impatiently grabbing his brother's flight suit collar. "You'll have plenty of time for that at breakfast." "Hey, it could be worse," Caden said as they finally exited their cabin into the now busy corridor. "At least they're not spending half their off hours making out like a certain other couple in your family." He was referring to Jean and her husband Bobby. Those two were constantly all over each other, at least when professionalism didn't mandate against it. Asher sighed. "Oh, don't get me started on them. One of the reasons I'm grateful they have a kid now is that it's probably the only thing keeping their stateroom from looking like a porno." "You do know Serenity's not my girlfriend, right?" Finn asked. He and Serenity were only 14 and not allowed to date yet, so they weren't exactly comfortable referring to what they had as a relationship. "Yeah, I know," Asher said, "but what else am I supposed to call it?" "Fair enough." Caden smiled to himself and rolled his eyes. The corridor walls were the same sterile white as the bedspreads in their cabin, and lined a black floor that was regularly polished by cleaner bots. Every few feet, the walls were dotted with cylindrical sconces that provided most of the light. The people who filled the corridor were a mix of passengers in civilian clothes and Olympus Federation members in black and blue uniforms, ranging from traditional military fatigues to flight suits like the ones Asher and Finn were wearing. Caden had to imagine that similar scenes were taking place in the multiple levels of the Britain, a starliner that had been named for the Battle of Britain in World War II and had served as his and his family and friends' home for the past month. And he couldn't say he was surprised. Today was the day their 30-day voyage would finally end, and they would be able to set foot on Serenity, an Earth-like moon in the Alpha Centauri system that would likely one day serve as humanity's new home. 30 years ago, most of Earth's landmass had been flooded in a cataclysmic event known as the Exodus disaster, so named for its biblical proportions. A highly decorated Olympus Federation admiral named Orion Powell, Bobby's grandfather, as fate would have it, had managed to save much of what was left of humanity by proposing the Dominion, a city in space made up of 8 interlocking space stations and built on the remnants of the International Space Station. And Orion had been elected the first emperor soon after. But even still, everyone had known that humans couldn't expect to survive on space or on the remains of the post-apocalyptic Earth forever. They would eventually need a new home. So when Caden was 3 years old, his father, a gifted astronomer, had discovered Serenity using long-abandoned calculations from the scientists of NASA's infamous Bishop's Meteorite project from the 2060s. He discovered the moon on the same day Caden's sister was born, hence why they shared the same name. However, it had taken till recently to actually sanction a mission, due to Wyatt fleeing into hiding just 3 years after the discovery. That was another story. Before long, the boys reached a turbolift that sat at a T-shaped end of the corridor. Once they were inside, Finn scanned his dog tags with a scanner on the panel to confirm their authorization. "Which symbol is the one for Ada Deck?" he asked. "It's the one that looks like a lowercase n with a longer right leg," Asher said impatiently, leaning against the wall. "Seriously, Finn, we've been living on the ship for a whole month. One would think you'd be familiar with the symbols for the different decks." "Well, sorry," Finn snapped. "It's not my fault the Greek alphabet is so freaking weird." He pushed the button Asher had indicated, which began glowing blue. They then descended 3 levels from their previous position at Delta Deck. After the doors opened, they entered a hallway filled with people in slate gray coveralls. Golden sparks showered everywhere, and the whole place smelled of machinery. Ada Deck, also known as the engineering deck, which was off limits to any passengers not in the Olympus Federation. Caden, Asher, and Finn headed over to a doorway on the right. The guy about Caden and Asher's age, which was 17, was seated at a slightly rusting metal table working on all sorts of contraptions. He had longish black hair, tanned skin, and a pair of heterochromatic eyes, brown on the left and green on the right. "Hi, Mike," Caden said cheerfully. Mike looked up from his workbench and smiled. "Hey, Caden." He extended similar greetings to Asher and Finn. "I'm assuming you guys are here for Caden's new legs?" They all nodded in unison. Caden knew Mike from his family's days living on Earth. Mike and his father had lived on a metal atol-like structure off the coast of San Francisco called the Pacific Bell, or the Pac Bell for short. Mike grabbed a pair of prosthetic legs from the workbench and set them onto the floor for Caden to see. "I'm sorry these took so long. I wanted to make sure they were just right." "You don't have to be sorry. I'm the same way with my drawings. I really like the joint work." "Thanks, but I can't take too much credit for it. Paxton Lewis was the one who suggested it." "Who's Paxton Lewis again?" "He's Vivian Lewis's younger brother," Asher explained. "She's Glory's girlfriend, one who works on the kitchen staff and makes really good banana bread." "Oh, yeah." "Ready to try them on?" Mike asked. "You know I am," Caden cheered. Mike then stretched a couple gel sleeves over Caden's knees to ensure the prosthetics wouldn't irritate the skin, and then added the legs. "Just a heads up, you're probably not going to want to walk on these right away. Your organic legs need time to get accustomed to them first." Caden was a little disappointed to hear that, as he'd been living without legs for the past few days, but a few more hours in the wheelchair wouldn't hurt him, so he nodded in understanding. Just then, Mike's father and the head of the engineering crew, Sam, entered with a greasy wrench in hand. He looked like an older version of Mike, except with short hair peppered with gray, a beard, and a matching pair of brown eyes. "Michael, I thought I told you to pick up our bagels from the mess hall. You should have already done it by now." Mike groaned and wiped his hands clean on a wet rag. "Sorry, Dad. I'll go get them now." Caden, Asher, and Finn quietly snickered to each other. They knew the real reason Mike hadn't gone to the mess hall yet was most likely Faye Swanson, a teenage member of the ship's kitchen staff. She and Mike got along about as well as a pair of wolves from rival packs at a deer carcass. Mike shot a knowing glance in their direction and sighed. I know, very funny. It's okay, Mike, Kane said once they'd calmed down. We'll go up with you if it'll help. We need to go get breakfast anyway. Asher opened his mouth to say something, but then his comm link started beeping. As soon as he clicked it on, Jean's tired, irritated voice emerged from the speaker. Asher, where are you? Finn and I took Caden to Ada Deck to pick up his new legs, Asher responded. Why? Well, I need you to get Ellery, Violet, and Posey out of bed and into the mess hall. My hands are kind of full with Millie right now. The incessant crying of her and Bobby's daughter Amelia, or Millie as everyone called her, confirmed she wasn't kidding. Why just me? Why can't Finn help too? Do you honestly expect anything productive to happen when he and Ellery are in the same room? She's got a point, Finn said through a smirk. Asher rolled his eyes. And because I know you're going to ask about Bobby and Travis, they're in the middle of a briefing with Colonel Ziegler and Major Henson, Jean added. Asher sighed. All right, I'll go get them. Good. And make sure Violet and Posey especially are fully dressed with their hair and teeth brushed. I don't need a repeat of last week's fiasco where you brought Violet to the mess hall with her hair all matted and then she complained when it got stuck in her food. Hey, last time I checked, Violet wasn't the one throwing sandworm eggs all over the floor, Asher retorted. That was Millie. Caden, Mike, and Finn all laughed at that, which got a sly smile from Asher. Ash, please, Jean begged. I'm already missing the briefing because Millie took a massive dump in her diaper this morning. I also need to give her a bath, and you know how much she hates those. Asher's expression softened, and then he sighed. All right, I'll go get the girls. Thank you, Jean cried, sounding immensely grateful. The call then ended. You heard Jean, Asher said to Caden and the others as he tucked his comlink away. I'll catch up with you guys soon. It's okay, Ash, Caden assured him. Plus, I get it. He solemnly thought back to all the times he'd helped Serenity through her panic attacks when they were younger. Hey, at least you don't have to worry about Faye, Mike offered with a wan smile. Asher smiled back and waved goodbye before heading back to the turbolift. Asher Falco felt irritation burn every inch of his body as he wound through the corridors of Delta Deck. He understood why Jean needed his help, but nonetheless felt irritating to be bossed around by his sister, who was only 3 years older than him. 2 years prior, the Falcos had lost their parents in a shuttle accident. Shortly after, Jean had taken over as head of their family. She'd barely been able to do so legally, only being 18 at the time, but it was the least she could do to keep Asher and the others from ending up in foster care. Bobby and his younger brother Travis, having lost their father and sister in the same accident, had pitched in to help as well, which was kind of why Bobby and Jean had gotten married sooner than they'd planned. But even still, it was hard work. Jean had expected Asher and Finn to help where they could, particularly when it came to taking care of their 3 younger sisters, Ellery, Violet, and Posey. Things only got further complicated from Bobby and Jean impulsively having unprotected sex the night of the accident, resulting in Millie's conception. Asher actually sometimes felt tempted to joke that Millie should have been named Oops for this reason, but he'd of course never admit this to Jean's face. He soon arrived at the 2 sets of doors he'd been looking for. Each bore 3 name plaques on the adjacent wall. One set read Captain Robert Powell, Lieutenant Jean Falco, and Amelia Powell, Bobby and Jean's stateroom. The other set read Ellery Falco, Violet Falco, and Posey Falco, the cabin Ellery, Violet, and Posey shared. Even without the name plaques, though, Asher still would have been able to single out his sister's room, thanks to the brightly colored crayon drawings Violet had plastered all over the door. He smiled at all the crudely drawn flowers, animals, and stick figures. Ever since Bobby had given her a new box of crayons for her most recent birthday, Violet had been drawing almost as obsessively as Caden. He was about to scan his fingerprints to open the door when he suddenly heard a guttural wail emanate from Bobby and Jean's room, followed by a gentle shushing and an exhausted-sounding lullaby. Asher frowned. It sounded like Jean still had her hands full with Millie. He was tempted to go in to help her, but reminded himself that he had a task to take care of first. The girls' cabin was surprisingly a lot less chaotic than the one next door. Ellery was already up and fully dressed, wearing an olive green jumpsuit and a pair of black lace boots that gleamed like beetle shells. She was in the bathroom with her toothbrush in her mouth and was tying her blonde hair into a partial ponytail with a cherry red ribbon. Now that she was 10, she liked showing off how independent she was. "Hey, Ellie," Asher said to her curtly as he passed by. Standing in her crib, shoved into the corner, was 2-year-old Posy. Her rumpled cotton shift and matted mop of golden hair made her look like a murder child from a slasher flick. She silently trailed Asher with her bright blue eyes. Finally, sprawled on the bottom bunk of the bunk bed she shared with Ellery and surrounded by animal plushies, was his only sibling who shared his straight reddish-brown hair aside from Jean, newly 5-year-old Violet. She wore a white nightgown with tiny pink flowers and had her hair that was long enough to sit on trailing down her back. She held her feet adorned with purple nail polish in the air, and she had a tablet playing her favorite cartoon, Bluey, propped up on a pillow. Asher smiled and gently tapped her shoulder. Violet paused her cartoon, removed her headphones, and smiled brightly upon seeing her brother. "Asher!" she cried, throwing her arms around him. "Hey, Slugbug," he said, returning the hug. "Are you ready to finally see Serenity today?" "Yeah, I even saved my favorite outfit for it." She pushed the blanket back, revealing a white t-shirt. "Awesome." He nodded toward the bathroom, which Ellery had just left. "Why don't you go get dressed?" "Okay." She excitedly picked up her clothes and dashed into the bathroom. While he waited, Asher took a moment to examine Violet's wall cubby. Most of it was decorated with more of her drawings. In the very center, though, was the very first photo they'd taken of their new family, right before stepping aboard the Britain for the first time. Bobby stood in the center with Jean, his arm draped around her. He was a whole head taller than her at 6'4", and was basically godly sexiness personified. Asher obviously wasn't attracted to him the same way Jean was. That would be so weird and wrong on so many levels. But he'd be lying if he said his brother-in-law hadn't played a role in his bisexual awakening. With his perfect dark auburn hair that flowed just the right way, his dreamy chocolate brown eyes, his chiseled jawline with just the right amount of faint stubble, his well-defined muscles that were visible even through the brown fighter jacket and black and blue fatigues he wore in the photo, even his slutty neck freckles. Jean had her long red-brown hair pulled back into a ponytail and was dressed in a simple NASA t-shirt and jeans. Millie, whom the photographer had had to make about 100 silly faces for in order to get her to smile, sat on Jean's hip, looking all cutesy with the butterfly shirt she was wearing and a large pink bow clipped into her hair. She looked a lot like Jean for the most part, but it was clear she'd inherited most of her coloring from Bobby's side of the family. She had wavy light auburn hair passed down to her from Bobby's mother, and those brown Powell eyes. Travis, Bobby's younger brother, stood to his brother's left. Looking at him, it was clear that the tall Jean ran in the Powell woman's blood, though he was a couple inches shorter than Bobby. He had the same light auburn hair and brown eyes as Millie, though he wore his hair cropped short. He wore Olympus Federation issue pants along with a t-shirt for Lake Powell, a man-made reservoir on the Utah-Arizona border that had long been a favorite vacation spot of the Falcos and Powells during their trips to Earth over the years. Bobby, Travis, and their family had often liked to joke that they were distantly related to John Wesley Powell, the Union soldier for whom the lake had been named. Neither they nor the Falcos were entirely sure of how true this was, but it made for a fun inside joke nonetheless. To Travis's right was Finn holding Posy. Finn was wearing a black t-shirt for Angels and Airwaves, one of their family's favorite bands, and white pants that had been tucked into boots. Posy was beaming in a simple white lace dress with her blonde hair bunched up into a pair of pigtails with pink ribbons. She'd been a lot more cooperative and smiling than Millie had been, which they'd found out later was because Finn had promised her a cheeseburger if she behaved. This had inevitably resulted in him getting a week-long grounding from Jean for the merits she'd had to spend on a burger so Posey wouldn't be sad. On the very far left was Ellery, standing high and mighty in a Star Wars t-shirt and a pair of denim shorts with her hair neatly tied up into a high ponytail with a green ribbon. And in between her and Jean were Asher and Violet. Asher had worn the same fatigue pants and t-shirt combos Travis had, though his shirt was for a science fiction movie from 2000 called Titan AE, which had always been a favorite of his and Violet's. He'd also proudly shown off his earrings and single-handed Black Manny for the photo, which Jean had not been a fan of. Violet stood directly in front of him, his hands resting in her hair, which had been pulled from her face with a white headband. She was wearing her favorite outfit of a white shirt and overalls, the very same clothes she was getting dressed into now. Asher pulled the locket out of his shirt collar and opened it, extracting a rolled-up wad of green paper. It had been a gift from his father, who'd explained it was called $1 and had once been used as currency on Earth. It was specifically a $2 bill, which had been extraordinarily rare even in the days when dollars were still being printed. But what specifically made this dollar special to Asher was the doodle Violet had drawn in black marker across its surface. It depicted a pair of stick figures representing the two of them riding a crudely drawn version of their sailboard, the Cosmic Castaway, named for their favorite song from Titan AE. He smiled and tucked the dollar back into the locket. He glanced across the room at Posey, who was now playing with her favorite bluebird plushie, Mr. Flitters. As he began to walk over to get her out of her crib, he caught sight of a drawing Violet had left on the spring green craft table in the middle of the room. She'd drawn it with her new set of crayons, and it was meant to be a replica of a photo she kept on the wall by her bed. Asher smiled when he noticed she'd used her red crayon to draw the hair of every red-headed person in their family. She still had a hard time grasping the concept that just because some people described their hair as red didn't mean it was the same as stark emergency light red. Returning his attention to Posey, Asher helped her out of her crib and dressed her in a green sweater before seeing her at the craft table so he could brush her tangled blonde curls. He silently thanked Finn for buying Mr. Flitter's forever ago. Posey had been significantly less fussy ever since the stuffed bird entered her life. Asher had just finished tying a green ribbon into her hair by the time Violet finally emerged from the bathroom. "I'm ready to get my hair done," she cheered, excitedly waving her hairbrush above her head. Asher smiled again and was about to help her brush her hair when he heard Millie screaming from the other room again. He looked at Ellery, who was now also seated at the table, munching on a slice of toast she must have gotten from the replicator. "Ellie, can you please help Violet with her hair?" he asked, setting Posey on the floor. Ellery pouted. "I helped brush her hair yesterday." Asher sighed. "If you help, I'll let you have my second cinnamon roll at breakfast." She made a show of considering his offer before motioning for Violet to sit in the chair next to her. "Thank you," he breathed with relief, "and keep an eye on Posey while you're at it." He then got up from his seat and headed to the door that led to Bobby and Jean's stateroom. Jean was seated on her and Bobby's bed, whose soft gray sheets were a rumpled mess. She was wearing one of Bobby's t-shirts, which was the same shade of gray as the bed sheets and fell to her mid-thighs. Her long auburn hair was a mess, and dark rings framed her exhausted blue eyes. She bounced a still wailing Millie, who was wearing red footy pajamas in her arms, and tried to sound soothing. "Hey, Jean, are you all right?" Asher asked. "No," she admitted honestly. Smoky black natural diamond on her engagement ring sparkled as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Asher offered to take Millie. He wasn't necessarily the best with his niece, but his sister really looked like she could use a break. Jean accepted and handed her daughter over. Asher took off his locket and swung it in front of Millie like a pendulum. She immediately stopped crying and started grabbing at it. Jean, who'd slumped onto her pillows, smiled. "Thank you." He looked at her nightstand where she kept a framed drawing Caden had gifted to her and Bobby next to her much-abused copy of Pride and Prejudice, a bottle of baby aspirin, and her wedding band. The sketch depicted Bobby and Jean on their wedding day, embracing and kissing passionately. Despite what the picture entailed, though, Jean didn't really like to talk about the day much, mostly because it had been more of a marriage practicality eve rather than the fairy tale wedding she'd been imagining since she and Bobby got engaged. Are Bobby and Travis done with the meeting yet? Asher asked. Yeah, Jean replied. They should be on their way to the mess hall now. Asher's eyebrows knit together. You didn't ask Bobby to help you with Millie? Jean shrugged. He's already got enough on his plate as is. Anything I can do? She shook her head. Just get the girls to the mess hall like he asked. I'll meet you there. Asher was tempted to argue, but his sister was clearly in no such mood, so he nodded, handed back Millie, and headed back into the girls' room. Ellery had finished brushing Violet's hair like he'd asked, and it was now held back with a white headband like in their family photo. Violet herself was in the middle of drawing curly-cue flowers with her crayons on a piece of paper. Posey was sitting on the floor, absent-mindedly playing with Mr. Flitters. All right, are you guys ready to go? Asher asked. Wait, Violet protested. I need to grab a few things first. Ellery rolled her eyes. You always need to grab something, Vi. Ignoring her, Violet stuffed a few crayons and some drawing paper into the large front pocket of her overalls. She then scampered over to her bed and pushed aside her pillow, revealing a photo of herself and her mother and a hollow disc held together with colorful duct tape, her and Asher's personal copy of Titan AE. Asher grinned as she tucked both of the items into her pocket as well. Now I'm ready, she said, smiling. Asher picked up Posey and Mr. Flitters and held out his hand for Violet to grab, which she did. Okay, let's go. Before they all headed out into the hallway, he stole one last somber glance at Jean's door. Serenity Maverick cut into her pancakes with her fork, the melted chocolate chips oozing into the creamy vanilla syrup. She smiled when she noticed the slightly charred edges. Finn wasn't exactly the best cook, but that never stopped him from venturing outside his comfort zone for her sake. She took a bite and chewed. Didn't hurt that they were also still delicious. She couldn't remember much about life before her mother left. After all, she'd only been 2 when the divorce happened. Somehow she could still recall how Sarah could almost magically turn their bland bran rations into the most delectable pancakes in existence. Serenity wasn't sure why she seemed so drawn to things that reminded her of her mother. She'd named the Raggedy Ann doll she kept safely tucked in her bunk back in her cabin after her. She regularly wore her hair braided like her mother's, though she sported 2 braids instead of 1 and tied them off with a pair of white silken ribbons. Even the song she was currently listening to on Caden's Discman, All of This by Blink-182 and Robert Smith, had been her mother's favorite. Perhaps it was because people often told her she looked like her mother. Perhaps it was because they almost had the same name. Her father had chosen the name Serenity for both her and the moon the Briton had spent the past month traveling to for a few reasons. The first was that the word serenity referred to the state of being calm, peaceful, and untroubled. What better term could be used to describe a potential new home for humanity? The second was that it had been the name of the spaceship from one of his favorite TV shows growing up, Firefly, a short-lived space western series from the early 2000s that was canceled after 1 season. Finally, it was because it had reminded him of her mother's name. The first part of Serenity did kind of sound like Sarah, after all. But Serenity felt that maybe perhaps the most likely reason was that she sought connection with someone she had a hard time remembering. The sharp stench of her brother's coffee was enough to break her out of her thoughts. She grimaced and took a sip of her hot chocolate. She had a hard time understanding what people like her brother saw in coffee. To her, it was hardly anything more than burnt bean water that smelled weird. Caden always insisted that adding sweeteners helped. He himself liked his coffee with milk sweetened with cinnamon and honey. But in Serenity's opinion, if you had to add something to a beverage to make it taste better, it probably wasn't worth drinking in the first place. Her gaze then fell to her brother's sketchbook. He was working on a drawing of the Greek myth that explained the origin of amethysts. According to the story, there was once a beautiful young maiden named Amethystos who took a vow of chastity to express her devotion to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and maidenhood. However, the wine god Dionysus had no regard for this and tried to rape her. Frightened, Amethystos begged Artemis to save her. Artemis answered her prayer and transformed her into a statue of rock crystal. Dionysus was immediately remorseful at the sight and cried tears of wine, turning the crystal purple. Caden's drawing specifically depicted the moment in the story where Dionysus wept over Amethystos' crystalline form. Serenity quite liked amethysts, especially since as someone born in February, they were her birthstone. She slid the headphones she was wearing to the collar of her white sweater and leaned over to get a better look at the picture. "You're doing a really good job with that, Cade," she said, smiling. "Thanks, Seren," Caden replied, sipping his coffee. "Wasn't sure what to draw, so I went with the first thing in my head." He took a bite out of one of the cinnamon rolls on his plate. She smirked. As an Olympus Federation pilot, Caden's diet mainly consisted of water, nutritive drinks, and rations, so getting to enjoy luxuries like cinnamon rolls was a rare treat saved for special occasions, like today when they were supposed to be touching down on the Serenity Moon for the first time. Violet scooted over with her mouth full of cinnamon roll and looked at the drawing of Dionysus and Amethystos. "Can I color this when you're done?" she asked sweetly, holding up her purple crayon. "Sure thing, Vi," Caden said with a smile. "I just need to finish these lines first, and then you can have it." "Yay!" Violet cheered. She then took another bite out of her roll. Asher, who was sitting next to her with one of his magazines in hand, laughed. "I'm impressed you know it needs the purple crayon." "Well, amethysts are purple, aren't they?" Violet asked. "Yes, they are," Caden confirmed. Smiling, Serenity took a moment to scan the other occupants of the table. Posey was seated in a high chair and very messily enjoying a sliced buttery baguette filled with grape jelly. And on the opposite end of the table, Ellery was sitting with her three best friends, a few glasses of orange juice, and a selection of pancakes slathered in maple and cherry syrup held between them. First, there was Kai Henderson, who had short reddish blonde hair and green eyes and wore a short-sleeved button-down that matched his eye color. And there was Taylor Sorensen, who had long, straight blonde hair that resembled corn silk and was pulled from her face with a headband stretched around her head. She also had light blue eyes and wore a shirt that was the same light shade of pink as the large flower on her headband. Her hair being straighter and slightly lighter than Ellery's were the only things keeping Serenity from mixing up the two of them in her peripheral vision. Finally, there was Taylor Murdoch. He was of Asian descent and had short, spiky black hair and brown eyes with epicanthic folds. He was also dressed in gray and needed a wheelchair to get around, which gave him a sort of bond with Caden. And unlike Caden, he still had his legs. He was just paralyzed from the waist down. He also happened to be deaf. His hearing aids and ability to read lips made it so others didn't need to use sign language when speaking to him, but he still couldn't communicate verbally on his own. To help with this, his father had designed him a pair of electronic gloves that were wirelessly connected to a computer stored inside his wheelchair. The computer could translate his signs into verbal English or Japanese, depending on which form of sign language he was using. Though his and Taylor Sorensen's names were spelled slightly differently, his with an O and hers with an E, it could still get confusing when you were referring to both of them in the same conversation. So to accommodate this, he usually went by his last name Murdoch. Finn passed them on his way to the table, a plate stacked with 2 cinnamon rolls in his hands. As he walked by Ellery, who was munching on a roll Serenity was pretty sure had been on Asher's plate minutes before, he jokingly tugged on her hair ribbon. "Finn," Ellery whined, scrambling to fix her bow. "Sorry," Finn said insincerely, smirking as he took a seat. Kai, Taylor, and Murdoch all giggled, but immediately stopped once Ellery glared at them. Finn, that wasn't very nice, Asher said, though Serenity could tell he was stifling a smirk. Finn shrugged. Not my fault her bow was just hanging within inches of my hand. Ellery rolled her eyes at him and shifted her attention back to her friends. Serenity hid her own smile behind her braids as Finn winked at her. Just then another newcomer arrived at the table. She was about Caden and Asher's age and had long honey blonde hair plaited away from her face in a braid, light skin, and bright leaf green eyes. She wore an Olympus Federation flight suit with the top unzipped and wrapped around her waist, revealing a black tank top underneath. It was Emma, Caden and Asher's other best friend. Upon seeing her, Caden, who'd been taking another drink from his coffee, immediately snorted it out, black liquid streaming out of his nose. Luckily, he was able to catch it with a napkin before it could land on his sketchbook. Hey, he said awkwardly. Hi, Caden, she replied, a dazzling smile gracing her lips. Is this seat taken? She gestured to the empty chair in front of her. Yes, actually, Asher interjected. We were saving it for Sticky Joe, who works in one of the ship's engine compartments. Who's Sticky Joe? Violet asked curiously. She was in the middle of drawing some mustaches in one of Asher's magazines. Emma smirked and shook her head as she finally sat down. He's joking, Violet. Oh, okay. Caden, likely still recovering from the pain of having a hot liquid rush through his nose, smiled shyly at Emma and tried to hide his blush. Serenity snickered. He's always giving me and Finn a hard time. Emma neatly set her breakfast down in front of her. It consisted of a mug of all-natural herbal wassail and a bowl of multigrain apple cinnamon oatmeal. Really, Emma? Asher asked once he saw what she was eating. He can't eat unhealthy even for a day. She gave him a nonchalant shrug. Didn't really feel like it today. Maybe next time. Unlike most of the Britain passengers who'd grown up in the Dominion, Emma had been born and raised on a farm on Earth, living with a biologist father and an herbalist mother. As such, she tended to prefer homemade dishes made from fruits, vegetables, and other plants naturally grown in a garden, even while traveling in space. And thankfully for her, Galen, her father, had joined the Britain mission to help study flora and fauna on Serenity, so access to the foods she liked wasn't difficult. And because her diet was already so healthy, she hadn't need to worry about subscribing to the rations-only diet of the other Olympus Federation members aboard the ship, much to Caden and Asher's chagrin. This is what you get for making fun of me for being a pescatarian, she joked once. Serenity couldn't entirely fault Emma's stubbornness, though. Galen and his wife Cassandra were amazing cooks, and Serenity had always loved eating at the Salvesons' house growing up. Not to mention, Emma's wassail and oatmeal did smell really good. So where is everyone else in the Falco Palace squad? Emma asked, swallowing a spoonful of oatmeal. Asher opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, almost as if in answer to Emma's question, Jean arrived carrying Millie. She was fully dressed in a white tank top and with her flight suit wrapped around her waist like Emma, and her reddish-brown hair was neatly brushed back into a high ponytail. The bags under her blue eyes made her look as though she'd woken up merely seconds before. Millie was wearing a white dress with pink floral designs and had a matching pink ribbon in her freshly combed light red hair, which was still slightly damp from a recent bath. She seemed calm, which sharply contrasted with how Asher had described her acting earlier that morning. Jean looked at Posey, whose mouth was covered in jelly from the baguette, and frowned. Asher, I thought I specifically told you not to let Posey have messy foods. Asher raised his hands defensively. Sorry. It can be kind of difficult to remember every single minute childcare instruction you've ever given me when I'm looking after a 10-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old at the same time. Fair point, Jean admitted. Emma stepped up to her and smiled at Millie. Hi, Millie. Millie smiled shyly and leaned against her mother's shoulder. Caden laughed, but Asher rolled his eyes. Emma then turned her attention to Jean. I can get her a high chair if you want. Jean smiled gratefully. Thank you, Emma. That would be helpful. As Emma briefly left to go fetch a high chair, Bobby and Travis finally entered. They both looked very handsome and put together in their flight suits, with Travis wearing a light brown fighter jacket over his. Serenity would obviously only ever have eyes for Finn, but even she could tell the Powell brothers were arguably the most gorgeous guys in the room, Bobby especially. Bobby pulled Jean close and kissed her, Travis grabbing Millie so she wasn't sandwiched between her parents. Serenity quickly looked away and held a hand over her eyes. She loved Bobby and Jean together, but they could be a little much sometimes. It wasn't all bad, though. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted Ellery motioning for Kai to grab her a paper bag from the napkin station, which she then vomited into. Asher also added, "Do you two really have to do that now?" Ignoring him, Bobby broke the kiss and gazed at Jean lovingly as he asked, "How's my beautiful wife this morning?" "Tired," Jean said honestly, though she was smiling. "Well, tell you what, why don't you grab a bite to eat and take a nap in her stateroom?" "Bobby, I can't do that. We've got a lot to take care of this morning." "Babe, come on," Bobby said, tilting his head. "You're exhausted. Plus, I haven't spent time with Millie all morning." He nodded toward their daughter, whom Travis was currently exchanging goofy expressions with. Asher groaned, which got Serenity to snicker a little. Millie wasn't old enough to choose favorite uncles yet, but it was already pretty clear whom she might eventually pick. Jean looked at her husband skeptically. To that, Bobby held up a triangular object wrapped in white parchment. "I already got you a ham and egg sandwich," he said playfully. She relented and allowed herself a wan smile. "Fine," she answered, taking the sandwich. He kissed her cheek. She then pointed sharply at him. "But if any funny business ends up happening while I'm asleep, I'm holding you personally responsible." Bobby laughed. "Yeah, I kind of figured." After one last kiss, Jean finally left. Serenity smiled to herself. Okay, that actually was pretty sweet. Travis then handed Millie to Bobby, and they joined everyone else at the table. Bobby smiled gratefully at Emma, who just returned with the high chair, before strapping Millie in. "So how's the wolf pack this morning?" he asked, using the nickname Travis had given to the fire squadron consisting of himself, Bobby, Jean, Caden, Asher, Emma, and Finn. "Awesome, Captain," Caden smirked, giving Bobby a fist bump. He gestured to his new prosthetics. "I got some new legs today, though I haven't gotten a chance to try them out yet." "Cool," Bobby said, stealing a glance at the legs. "I'm assuming Mike designed them?" "Yeah," Caden confirmed, but he told me he had help this time around from Paxton Lewis, Gloria Oliveira's girlfriend's brother. "Neat. Speaking of which, at the meeting I invited Gloria and Paxton to eat with us. I hope that's all right." "It is," Asher assured his brother-in-law. "By the way, that reminds me, how did the meeting go?" "Awesome," Travis said. "Colonel Ziegler says we should be in launch vicinity right on schedule." He turned to Caden and Serenity. "Your dad also noticed that there's a solar panel ring around Proxima Centauri." Serenity raised her eyebrows. "A solar panel ring? How's that even possible? Aren't we in an unexplored part of space?" "Supposedly, though interestingly, none of the panels in the ring look like the ones made on Earth. Wyatt says they look entirely alien." Finn's eyes lit up with excitement. "So it's possible we might encounter some aliens while we're here?" "Yeah," Travis said. "Pretty cool." "Are they going to eat us?" Violet asked worriedly. "It's okay, Vi," Bobby assured her, taking her hand. "We don't know for certain if whatever built the panels is still around, but even if it is and it ends up being unfriendly, we can take it down. Right, Asher?" Asher nodded in affirmation and placed his hand on top of Violet's. "You heard him, Sludbug." Violet smiled in relief and promptly went back to her coloring. "Am I hearing stuff about aliens?" a lovely melodic female voice asked. Serenity looked up to see a beautiful young woman of Brazilian descent who looked to be in her early 20s. She had long, thick, gorgeous black curls tied up into a ponytail and wore shimmering blue eyeshadow and dark eyes framed by long lashes. She was also dressed in the black and blue of a typical Olympus Federation uniform, though she was wearing regular military fatigues since she wasn't a pilot. Standing next to her was a boy who looked closer to Caden and Asher's age and was much shorter by comparison. He had short dark blonde hair, fair skin, and sea green eyes, and dressed in a forest green shirt. Hey, Glory, Bobby greeted the woman. He then looked at the boy. You must be Paxton. Come sit. Bom dia, Linda, Glory exclaimed upon seeing Millie. Millie giggled sweetly. Hey, Mike told me you helped me with the joint work. Mike told me you helped with the joint work on my new legs, Kane said to Paxton, pointing to his prosthetics. Oh, yeah, Paxton replied, smiling shyly. I spotted him working on them last night and thought I'd offer some tips. Well, I can't wait to try them out, Kane continued. They look super cool. Thanks, Paxton said appreciatively. Be sure to let me know how they're working once you get a chance to walk on them. I always love seeing my work in action. A kitchen worker around Glory's age then arrived, carrying a heaping tray of food in her gloved hands. She had the same dark blonde hair as Paxton, though hers was long and braided and stuffed into a hairnet. She also had tawny brown eyes and wore the typical ice blue shirt and pants of Britain kitchen workers. Vivian, Paxton's older sister and Laurie's girlfriend. Good morning, Viv, Bobby greeted her cheerfully. Hi, Bobby, she replied with a bright smile. Her voice as lovely and melodic as Glory's. I got the omelets you and Travis ordered. She placed an omelet in front of each of the Powell brothers. Thanks, Viv, Travis said. For the little one, I got her favorite. Vivian smiled at Millie as she set a plate of scrambled eggs sprinkled with cheese and ketchup on the high chair tray. Finally, she turned her attention to Glory and Paxton. These are for you, Pax. She handed him a pair of orange rolls. Paxton looked impressed. Wow, I didn't even ask for these. Well, I'm not the one you should be thanking, Vivian admitted. She nodded toward a girl in the kitchen with braided white blonde hair and eyes the same ice blue as the kitchen uniforms, who was working on a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls. Audrey was the one who made them. Paxton's expression suddenly turned awkward. Oh, well, give her my thanks when you get the chance. Strange, Serenity thought, but she knew better than to ask. Vivian briefly gave her brother a concerned look before beaming at Glory. This is for you, my love, specially paid by yours truly. Glory's breakfast consisted of a bowl of acai berries mixed with guarana syrup and topped with granola, strawberries, and sliced bananas, a bunch-shaped corn cake, and a glass of steaming milk mixed with coffee. Serenity searched her brain for the Brazilian foods she knew and was eventually able to identify each of the dishes. Acai Nutella, bolo de fubá, and pingando, respectively. Glory sampled each and smiled at Vivian, lovingly taking her hand. These taste amazing, Vivi. Obrigado. You think so? Vivian asked, looking relieved. Because I'm still reeling from when Yasuma over there got mad at me for messing up her spanakopita the other day. She gestured to an elderly woman with short white hair and a turquoise bathrobe seated across the mess hall at a table with a bunch of elderly women who were also wearing pastel-colored bathrobes. Estes Book Club, Serenity thought. She hadn't even noticed them earlier because she'd been too busy listening to Caden CD. The book club consisted of some of the most eccentric elderly women aboard the ship and were headed by Estes Swanson, paternal grandmother and legal guardian of Faye, one of the kitchen workers. They were somewhat infamous on the ship for their discussions of trashy romance novels with explicit sex scenes, even when there were young children around, much to the dismay of passengers who had young children like Bobby and Jean. Another reason they were despised were their early morning skinny dipping sessions in the ship's pool, which they always initiated without warning. The fact they were currently wearing bathrobes indicated that they'd just gotten done with the session. Ellery and Taylor looked at each other, smiled, and shouted in a loud imitation of Yasumo's high-pitched voice, Ya! Si! Mo! Almost everyone at the table burst out laughing. Vivian didn't join in, but smiled and rolled her eyes in amusement. The girls were referencing an incident that had happened toward the start of the voyage. Yasumo was originally from Greece and didn't know a word of English, so Vivian had tried to make small talk with her at lunch one day by asking her how to say the names of certain items in the mess hall in Greek. Poselene table, Vivian had asked. Yasamo, Yasamo had replied. Vivian had then tried again a few more times, only to get the same result. She then got so frustrated that she'd started pounding on the table with her fist. Poselene table. And that was when Yasamo had emphatically shouted, Yasimo! Yasimo! It wasn't until later that Vivian had learned that Poselene actually translated to "What is your name?" that the phrase she'd actually been looking for had been postelete, which admittedly sounded pretty similar. Needless to say, she'd pretty much given up on ever trying to speak Greek again after that. Ha ha, very funny, Vivian said. At least she really liked the gyros I'd made her that day. You mean gyros, Caden corrected her. Seriously? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Caden nodded with a smirk. Gyros are my favorite Greek food. Of course I know how to pronounce their name. Vivian shrugged and shook her head. Whatever. After everyone laughed again, she then set down a loaf wrapped in tinfoil, final piece of food on her tray. Last but not least, I could not forget to leave you all with some banana bread to share. My treat. She winked. Serenity grinned. Vivian's banana bread was almost legendary among the Britain passengers. And Bobby and Emma sliced the warm golden brown loaf and served it to everyone at the table with butter. Serenity sank her teeth into her slice and smiled as she chewed and swallowed. As expected, it was delicious. Violet, while still in the middle of eating her own slice, grabbed a clean sheet of drawing paper and drew something with her yellow crayon. She then handed it to Vivian. For you! Vivian looked at the drawing and smiled. It depicted an anthropomorphic slice of bread with a smiley face. I love this, Vi. Thank you. Violet beamed with pride. His name is Brady. He's your new friend. Well, I'm sure he'll be a massive help to me in the kitchen, Vivian said, neatly folding the drawing and tucking it into her pant pocket. So where's the missus? She asked Bobby. I encouraged her to get some rest, Bobby replied. He fed Millie a forkful of eggs and smirked. You know how it is. Taking care of so many kids can be hard. He gestured to Ellery, Violet, Posey, and Millie. A sad look then entered his eyes, but he didn't elaborate. Well, at the very least, she doesn't have to deal with those inappropriate hermits right now, Asher commented. He pointed to the book club table as he took a sip of coffee. Larry, one of the only two men in the club, who also happened to be the only one who wore swimwear during the skinny dipping sessions, he specifically wore swim briefs, was currently leading their discussion. Can you imagine having to choose between fighting a bunch of basketball heads and little green men so you can get a ride back to Earth, or getting parasites implanted so you can bump uglies with 7-foot-tall blue aliens with gigantic spiky balls who see you as little more than a baby factory? He asked, adjusting the folds of his blue robe. At that point, I'd rather run out into the tundras of Nothoff and die of hypothermia. He nudged his husband, Frank, who was also wearing a blue robe, along with a gigantic pair of Terminator glasses. Am I right, Frank? What? Frank shouted. Never mind, Larry replied, rubbing his ears. Serenity allowed herself a small laugh. That actually had been kind of funny. Murdoch smirked and began signing. It's too bad Frank never lets my dad help with his hearing aids, his wheelchair computer translated. It'd save him a lot of trouble. Kai, Ellery, and Taylor giggled along with him. Serenity turned back to the table where Blythe Ann, a woman with long gray hair and a canary yellow robe, was now rubbing her own ears. Seriously, Larry, you really should have Frank get his hearing aids checked. He's the loudest person I've ever met. Not for me, said Estee, who was recognizable by her pink robe, blue eyes, and wavy shoulder-length white hair decorated with flower barrettes and pastel-colored streaks. The loudest person I knew was my second husband, and somehow even he was a more tolerable person to be around than Faye's grandfather. Larry shrugged. I try, but Frank is more stubborn than a cockroach. Never mind, Estee sighed, waving a manicured hand dismissively. Back to the book. I have to agree with you, Larry. I mean, Faye's grandfather was already a petulant brat whenever I said no to sex, but at least he valued my autonomy more than the squee ever would have. What kind of BS are they reading now? Kaden asked Asher. I don't know, Asher replied, but it's disgusting me less than that novella they read the other week about Dr. Ashingtonford boning Dr. Girdley Chund after he turns into a hot and sexy coronavirus. Who's that girl sitting with them? Caden questioned. Serenity looked at the person her brother had indicated. She appeared to be around 18 based on looks alone, and had wavy waist-length beach blonde hair partially pulled from her face by a series of braids and ribbons. Her skin had traces of a golden tan, but was otherwise fair. Makeup had been artfully applied to her face, and her violet blue eyes matched the heart-shaped gemstone hanging from a silver chain around her neck. Serenity wasn't entirely sure why she hadn't noticed the girl until now. Along with the ribbons in her hair, she wore a sleeveless white lace top and a long pink tulle skirt covered in butterflies that almost made her look like a fairy. Oh, that's Rachel, Emma explained. She seems nice. And almost as if Estee had read their minds from across the mess hall, she turned to Rachel and asked, Rachel, dear, what do you think? Rachel smiled. Well, quite frankly, I don't understand Georgie at all. She held nails covered and polished the same shade of pink as her skirt to her chest. I mean, if I were in her shoes, I'd be ditching Vectel at the first chance. I don't care if he's hot. To me, there's nothing attractive about a guy, or in his case, an overly thirsty horned alien who's weirdly into the idea of getting someone pregnant and doesn't understand a woman's lady bits. Everyone at the book club table laughed at her comment. Estee then noticed an empty plate on the table and called toward the kitchen. Hey, honey, could you please bring us some more baklava? A teenage girl with the same blue eyes as Estee and extremely long fire-red hair tied back and tucked into a hairnet groaned and headed to a counter with the nut and honey-filled phyllo pastries. Coming right up, Grandma. Someone looks pissed, Asher laughed. Serenity grinned. You should have seen her earlier when Kaden and Finn showed up with Mike to pick up the engineering team's bagels. Oh, that reminds me, Travis realized as he finished his last bite of omelet. I can't stay. I need to get breakfast to the passengers on Omega Deck. Serenity's eyes widened as she exchanged a look with Kaden. Neither of them had really been thinking much of Clarity, Kaden's younger twin, who was currently in a coma on Omega Deck all morning. Is Clarity all right? Kaden asked. Travis nodded. She's stable, surprisingly thanks in large part to Derek. He's the brother, right? Serenity asked, the one who's super antisocial. Because she didn't have the same clearance that Travis and Kaden had, she hadn't been allowed to visit Clarity on Omega Deck like they had. Travis and Kaden nodded in response to her question. Aside from Clarity, there were two other passengers staying on Omega Deck, a pair of siblings named Derek and Nerissa Valkyrie. They had snuck aboard the ship during a cargo transfer and claimed to have originated from Hades Station, a gigantic prison the Dominion maintained in the Kuiper Belt. This had come as a complete shock, as Hades was theoretically only supposed to be home to some of the worst Dominionite criminals, and Derek and Nerissa were just a pair of otherwise ordinary teenagers, being 19 and 16 respectively. But they'd been dressed in the customary gray Hades coveralls and even had the identification tattoos on their forearms, so there'd been no reason to disbelieve them. They'd seemed like they'd been through a lot, so Colonel Ziegler had allowed them to join the voyage to Serenity without pressing charges, and even offered to let them have free lodging on the standard passenger decks. Derek, who hadn't really seemed like the type to trust anyone, had insisted on his and Nerissa's remaining on Omega Deck, where they'd been discovered in the first place for the remainder of the voyage. This was in sharp contrast to his sister, who was nothing but open and friendly, according to everything Serenity had heard. I'll let you guys know if Clarity shows any signs of waking up, Travis promised, cleaning up his plate. Thanks, Trav, Kane said gratefully. Everyone said goodbye to Travis as he left. A moment of awkward silence passed before Vivian broke it. I should probably get back to the kitchen, she said. Let me know if you guys need anything. She kissed Gloria, ruffled Paxton's hair, and waved goodbye. Hey, do you guys want to hear about this cool flower my dad discovered in the Serenity Flora samples? Emma offered, trying to change the subject. Everyone eagerly agreed and listened. Serenity tried to finish her pancakes. Suddenly, she didn't feel so hungry anymore.